Hi everyone, I'm Amrutha and I'm a software engineer on the Microsoft Graph Toolkit team. And I'm super excited to be here to talk to you about our latest addition into the toolkit, which is our Electron provider. So before I start talking about what the provider is, let me give you a brief overview on the toolkit itself. So the Microsoft Graph Toolkit is a collection of UI components and authentication providers that make using the Microsoft Graph super easy. So where the UI components are concerned, these are fully functional right out of the box, and you just have to add about 1 to 2 lines of code to get beautiful data-rich experiences that use data from the graph. So for example, the best place to get started with our components is mgt.dev. You can play with all the components here, you can customize them, and you can use them in your application. So for example, this people picker here fetches data people information from the graph. So it's actually a multi-select dropdown. And all you have to do is include this tag in your HTML script, and you're good to go. Similarly, you have agenda information, and so just with one tag, you get all this beautifully rendered agenda data from the graph. So that's you can play with all the other UI components here, but the other side of the toolkit is authentication providers. So if you can imagine, all these components that you're using in your app, they're all calling the graph, right? And even otherwise, if you're using the graph in any way in your app, you need to be authenticated. So that's where our providers come in. And so we have different authentication providers that, again, make it super easy to get authenticated in your app with Microsoft Identity. And we have different providers for each platform that you may be building on. So for example, if you're building a web app, then you'll be using our MSAL provider. If you're building a SharePoint web part, you'll be using SharePoint provider. And if you're building a Teams tab, then you'll be using a Teams provider. And there's a quick example here. So if you wanted to authenticate on using Microsoft Identity with the graph on your web app, then this is pretty much all the code you need. You just have to say providers.global provider equals new MSAL provider and provide the client ID of your app registration. And what's great about this provider, like I had mentioned before, is that it's not only to get authenticated for your MGT components to work, but this provides an endpoint through which you can call any graph API as well. So without further ado, let me jump into a simple Electron, like boilerplate code that I downloaded. It's pretty much blank and I haven't added any code in it, but I've just npm installed these packages that we would need. And what we're trying to achieve through this app is to make a very simple to-do application that pulls data from your Microsoft to-do. So yeah, I npm installed these. And for those of you who are new to Electron, Electron is an open source framework that's used to build native applications that are cross-platform because it relies on very fundamental web technology like HTML and JavaScript, and it's based on a Node.js runtime for the backend and a Chromium front end. And it has 2 kinds of processes, main and renderer. And every Electron app can only have one main process because it's responsible for the lifecycle of the whole application. So you can think of main as the back end and renderer is the front end. And you'll have as many renderers as the number of pages. So here we're only looking at one renderer process, one page. So I only have one renderer. And this is I cloned this from a Git repository by Electron, so I haven't added any code here. This is pretty much the boilerplate code that you get. So to start authenticating, that's the first step we're going to do to get authenticated, to be able to use the graph. You need to add 2 things. You have to initialize, one is the Electron Authenticator, and the other is the Electron provider. So the Electron Authenticator is going to sit in main.ts, and Electron provider is going to sit in the renderer where all your components are going to be. So let's get started with that. I'm just going to import the authenticator, and I'll talk about what they do in just a second. Import the authenticator, and here I'm going to add config object. So what the authenticator does, Electron Authenticator basically does all the work. It's going to set up all your config variables like your client ID, and it's also responsible for getting access tokens for you to be authenticated. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm setting up all the config variables, and initializing the Electron Authenticator by passing in this config object. Now, on the renderer side is actually even easier. This is where we're going to be initializing the Electron provider. I'm just going to write these import statements really quickly. So I'm importing the Electron provider. I'm also importing the components that we're going to be using in our index.html. And then all I have to do is add this one line of code, and we are authenticated. And now let's go to our index.html, and I'm going to add these components here. Run an npm and start. So what I've added is the MGT login component that's going to help you log in and then display your photo and your name. The MGT person is going to show you some person details of the person logged in, and the to-do is going to show you the to-do tasks of the person. So we have to sign in. I'm going to sign in as Megan. Put the password in. And that's it. That's all you needed to get this beautifully rendered to-do list. And then you can go ahead and customize this. You can add, remove tasks, etc. So that was how to get started with the Electron provider. I also, I built the same app again before this. It basically does the same thing that we saw earlier, except it has one hidden feature that I'm really excited to show you. So right now, Megan is available on Teams, right? She's just doing her work at her normal pace. She has this beautiful wallpaper of Mount Rainier. And then, I don't know about you, but during the pandemic, I have a really hard time focusing. And I usually go into this do not disturb mode when I don't want people pinging me and I'm really trying to get something done. And once I turn to do not disturb, firstly, my app turns to dark mode. And I did this solely for the purpose of showing off the fact that all our MGT components have dark theme enabled. Just by adding a class to each of them called MGT dark, you can get the dark theme. But also, when I'm trying to focus, I like to be reminded that I need to be working. So my wallpaper changed to this giraffe that tells me, I'm watching you, get back to work. And similarly, when after work, I try to appear away so that, again, people know I'm done with work. But I have this bad habit of continuing to try, when I'm supposed to be off work, I still try to send the last email, or I'm just not even doing something productive, but I'm still on my laptop. So then my wallpaper changes again to this little cat telling me to work out. So what I'm doing here in the back, in the app, is that I'm pulling for presence data from the graph to actually change my wallpaper based on what my presence is on Teams. So let me just quickly show you how to do that. So this is the same renderer code that we saw just now, where I'm initializing the Electron provider. And all I'm doing is also calling the graph using the endpoint that we saw, that I talked about earlier. The fact that the providers or global provider exposes an endpoint through which you can call any of these graph APIs. And I'm also using, so I want to be able to pull for presence data every 5 seconds. So what I do is I listen to this event. So onState changed is called every time there's a login or a logout event. So I call that event, and then I check if someone's signed in, and I call this check presence function. That basically every 5 seconds, because I've set an interval here for 5 seconds, every 5 seconds, I call the presence API and get presence information. And I'm also updating, so as you can see here in the person component, you can update the presence so manually. So I actually pull that from the DOM. I pull that element from the DOM, and I pass this presence object so that even this is updated every time I pull for presence data. So yeah, that's the end of my demo. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and hopefully it excited you to use the Electron provider. It's going to be released, like Beth said, I think sometime next week. So please stay tuned and let me know if you have any questions, and I'm happy to help. Thank you.
Excellent. Really cool stuff, Amrutha. So,
Thank you.
And great demo, great clarification on how things are working.